It's a pity that men try to hide their emotions. I'm happy when I know a man who lets himself feel the things we do. Life with such a man can be so spontaneous, so much fun.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.
You are watching the single most expensive video ever made in the history of active research and informed opinion, or à-bas-le-ciel, my two YouTube channels, because a viewer sent in a copy of this book, a heavy tome that I now will not have time to read, in exchange for my making this video. I have an Amazon wish list where any supporter of the channel can buy me a book. If I have the humility to list books that I can't afford, and this one was about $100 local price, so thank you to that long-time supporter of the channel. And as I say, I now get to go into a kind of self-loathing cycle because I have a stack of really worthwhile books to read, and I don't know how long it's going to be before I get around to this one. Anyway, this longtime supporter of the channel wrote in and said, hey, how much would I have to pay you for you to do a video talking about nuclear proliferation, nuclear rearmament, with a special focus on the strategic situation of Australia and thus the whole continent of Asia? And I said, hey, you wouldn't have to pay me a dime. I'd be happy to do it for free. But if you click on this link, there is actually a list of books. And I said also, I don't know your financial situation. It might be that $15 is a lot of money to you. It might be $30 a lot of money to you. But there are books there that you can buy to support me and directly or indirectly support the caliber of intellectual content on the channel. If I actually read this whole thing, doubtless, at least indirectly, it would be influencing some of the topics I'd be discussing on camera. All right. The first major misconception members of my generation are burdened with about nuclear weapons is the assumption that if someone presses a button, it's the end of the world. Or if a single nuclear bomb is dropped, it's going to wipe out a whole country. This is not true. Nuclear weapons can be used on a small scale with tremendous efficacy and with very few further knock-on consequences. Indeed, this makes them kind of more scary in a sense because there isn't this clear line that no one dares to cross. Let's say there's a fleet of ships in the ocean. Nuclear weapons can quite effectively wipe out that fleet of ships without permanently poisoning or rendering uninhabitable a large plot of land. And indeed, the historical reality of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Hiroshima is a densely populated city today. It didn't result in a nuclear wasteland. It wasn't the apocalyptic scenario that many people imagine, that we've been kind of prepared for more by science fiction than by the study of real political history. Secondly, there is a deep assumption that the possession of nuclear weapons by mutually antagonistic countries will create a situation of, shall we say, impossible to violate sovereignty on either side. That the possibility of mutually assured destruction through nuclear weapons will lead both parties, or all parties in a system of many different rival powers, to just say, look, whatever's going on in your country is your problem. We're not going to cross the border. We're not going to negotiate with you. We're not going to try to bully you one way or the other. We're going to keep our nose out of your business because you have nuclear weapons. And the exact opposite is true. Nuclear armament leads to mutual intrusion, mutual intrusiveness. Now, currently we have unfolding in Belarus a question of the legitimacy of their government. They have had illegitimate elections, or quashed elections, you might say, and the leader there is increasingly unpopular, and he's regarded as an unjust dictator. Okay, so that's one set of moral considerations and conundra. What if he had nuclear weapons, right? How much more interested would other powers be in intruding into the politics of Belarus, possibly including military intrusion, but intervention of one method or another, if whoever rules Belarus also had nuclear weapons? And again, you have to remove the first assumption. It's not that, if he had nuclear weapons, he could take over the world. North Korea is not going to take over the world, right? There's no plausible threat of North Korea taking over the world. But could North Korea wipe out a single American aircraft carrier in the ocean, or a cluster of American naval vessels? Yes, something like that is quite attainable for North Korea. Could North Korea wipe out one city in South Korea? Yes, that's quite attainable for North Korea. So again, when you kind of both lower down the scale of the threat and then understand the instability that comes with each and every change of regime in each and every country that has nuclear weapons, even if it's through a legitimate election, you realize that nuclear proliferation makes the whole system of mutually invidious, even if democratic, world government much more mutually intrusive. I'm intentionally not using a word like responsible because it doesn't lead to greater responsibility. People may be reckless and irresponsible, but they're intruding into one another's sovereignty. Great example, communism in Cyprus. Do you recall that in the year 2008, the tiny island of Cyprus elected a communist government? It wasn't a communist revolution. They had a democratically elected communist government. It was a complete disaster for the people of Cyprus. It also had tremendous knock-on consequences economically for the people of all of Europe. What if Cyprus had nuclear arms? What if there was a threat going far beyond, the mere question of the welfare or democratic future of Cyprus, or what's economically advantageous for Europe as a whole, or the stability of the banking system? Those questions matter. Those are real problems. What if Cyprus had nuclear weapons? How then do you start to draw the line? How then do you start drawing treaties? When people say, look, we can no longer tolerate any of these nations, no matter how small. Like, we can't allow Luxembourg or Cyprus or a country the size of North Korea to have a dictator who might be as terrible as Joseph Stalin or might be as terrible as Adolf Hitler. Because if they have nuclear weapons, we must step in, we must snuff that out. We must provide them with a government that fits some definition of normalcy, reliability, and trustworthiness immediately as soon as it happens. Now, I have a real question for you to ask yourselves that I can't answer. Does that lead to the world being more fragile politically or more robust? Would the government of Saudi Arabia be allowed to continue being a theocracy and a dictatorship in perpetuity forever if Saudi Arabia becomes a country that not only has nuclear weapons, but that actively uses nuclear weapons? So let's just suppose, hypothetically, Saudi Arabia starts solving its problem in Yemen with the small-scale effective use of nuclear weapons. So again, not rendering Yemen uninhabitable by human beings for many centuries, but let's just say, they wipe out some boats, they wipe out some military bases, with none of the serious long-term consequences that we've learned to fear, but with some of the serious long-term consequences that the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had in Japan. If Saudi Arabia in this context were to become a muscular, nuclear-armed country, what then would be the response of the rest of the world? And I think most people are just profoundly uncomfortable with not knowing the answer to that question. Why are we uncomfortable? Because it's going to happen anyway. Israel has nuclear arms. Japan has nuclear arms. The official position of the government of Japan is that they have a proximate nuclear deterrent. Proximate. So Japan will say that on Japanese soil right now, there are no assembled, ready to launch nuclear warheads. But if they ever need them, they can press a button or make a phone call, and all the pieces that are needed to assemble a working nuclear warhead can be assembled in a very short span of time and put into a nuclear missile. So Japan, in reality, has nuclear weapons, right? I don't recall any pressure from the United States or Europe or anyone else to disarm Japan. And indeed, I don't even think China is uncomfortable with it. I don't think China minds Japan has nuclear weapons. And who could the Japanese possibly use nuclear weapons against? Most likely China. Yes, also theoretically Russia, but the possibilities are very slim and very few. Now, I've been asked, and indeed I've been bribed to talk about the circumstance of Australia in the world. But if we're being honest, the situation of Australia is typical. It's not really special. Probably what I would say about Australia is what I would say about every other country in the world, big and small. Australia historically has seen it as being in its self-interest to refuse to have nuclear weapons and to try to bully other nations, especially poorer nations like Indonesia, into signing up to non-proliferation treaties. In plain English, Australia would sign a treaty and make a solemn moral declaration that Australia itself would never have nuclear weapons, and then ask poorer countries like Indonesia to also vow that they will not have nuclear weapons. And this is all unfolding hypocritically under so-called nuclear umbrella agreements with the United States of America. That term is used especially by the Japanese. The idea that if some other country allied with the United States really had a problem, the United States would be the one providing the nuclear weapons. So that's the other reality. Another way to have a proximate nuclear weapon is, oh, well, we don't have any nuclear weapons. However, there's a submarine just a few meters off of our capital city run by the United States military that has a nuclear missile in it that can launch at any time. This is the height of hypocrisy, but both Japan and Australia are capable of calling in American nuclear weapons, and submarines are one of many mobile platforms for them to be delivered and deployed from Australian territory or from Japanese territory. So, this was a Cold War approach where the treaty itself would become a sort of fig leaf over the reality of the proliferation of nuclear arms on all sides. And meanwhile, in case you didn't hear, the other big dominoes have already fallen. India, Pakistan, Israel. Many people speculate aloud that in reality, Iran secretly may have nuclear weapons, or like Japan, may have a proximate nuclear threat. They may have everything they need to assemble a nuclear weapon in a jiffy, if and when they feel the need to. So, the real question to ask is it in Australia's interest to be a country like Japan that plays both sides of the fence? Or is it in Australia's interest to be a country like the United States of America, India, and so on, that openly possesses nuclear weapons? Well, in Australia's case, there is not much of a disadvantage to openly possessing nuclear weapons, because I think Australia would be willing to sign a treaty that says, hey, if we ever have an illegitimate election, if we ever have a dictator take over, if we have some kind of collapse in government, we're going to sign this treaty and we're going to invite the international community, to use the parlance of our times. We're going to invite other countries to intervene and then hold proper elections and get rid of the government that has taken over. We, Australia, do not want to descend into the kind of situation that has just happened in Belarus. We do not want to descend into the kind of situation that happened in Germany in the years leading up to World War II. We do not want to decay from a legitimate democracy to an illegitimate one, no matter how temporarily popular in the short term such a regime might be. So it is quite possible for Australia to both accept the responsibility of having nuclear weapons and to accept this much, much higher level of mutual intrusion that comes when every country has to scrutinize every other country to make sure that the people in charge are of sane, rational, responsible mind, that they are not going to use nuclear weapons in a way that will have devastating consequences for their neighbors or for the world. Now, would I prefer to live in a world in which Greece has nuclear weapons and Turkey has nuclear weapons? Okay? Right now, if you don't know, the ancient animosity between Greece and Turkey is resuming once again. Well, Greece would prefer that. Turkey would prefer, whether or not I would prefer that. You know who would prefer that neither Greece nor Turkey have nuclear weapons? France. France right now is in North Africa. I can't even say rebuilding the French Empire. They're building a new French Empire in North Africa. The whole Western world is just kind of sleepwalking through this and doesn't care. Guess who cares? Turkey cares. Egypt cares. Greece has its own battles with the Turks for unrelated reasons, basically. As long as neither Greece nor Turkey has nuclear weapons, France feels disproportionately powerful in tromping around that whole part of the world. Did you notice that the Prime Minister of France flew in to Lebanon after the massive explosion in Beirut destroyed the harbor there and so on? This is only a couple weeks ago now. Did you notice that? Why do you think he did that? Do you think he just felt like taking a vacation in the middle of coronavirus? Do you think that was for no reason at all? France has, shall we say, very muscular diplomacy in the region. France has nuclear weapons, right? So, I might prefer to live in a world where none of these powers have nuclear weapons. Even the current circumstances, 2020, the scale of this conflict is moderate to small. All these countries are capable of sorting out their differences in Libya, sorting out their differences in Syria, sorting out who controls what with Lebanon. This is certainly not, the brink of World War IV or anything of the kind. But you have to recognize that, it is in the self-interest of the people of Turkey to have nuclear weapons, and it is then in the interest of the people of Greece to have nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth for every invidious division all around the world. So what is the real solution? It's probably going to be treaties that define minimum standards for democracy, minimum standards for legitimacy of government, that would not merely have consequences for a place like Belarus right now, like say, hey, if you don't meet these minimum standards, what we consider a real election and a real government, would have also very serious consequences for a country like the United States. I'm old enough to remember the year 2000 when a guy called George W. Bush was illegitimately elected president of the United States in rigged elections that nobody did anything about, that the international community, in quotation marks, didn't intervene in any way. You could start signing really binding treaties that require the competence and responsibility and democracy and transparency of governments. And, if you become a nuclear power where you're willing to hold yourself as a country to that higher standard, and where you accept that if the quality of democracy falters in your country, that can happen. It can happen due to an earthquake. It can happen due to a plague. And it can happen because the whole population is swept up in a passion for a short time and they push a dictator into power, or, for some other reason, democracy falls apart. We say, okay, look, we understand that other countries can't allow us to go through a period of chaos and anarchy or dictatorship or communism or fascism. They're not going to tolerate that because we have made the decision to have a stockpile of nuclear weapons.
Être célèbre très jeune, ça vous apprend très vite à faire des choix. Des choix de films, de réalisateurs. Sinon, on ne tient pas sa vie, on s'aperçoit qu'on ne sait pas où on va. Pour l'argent, c'est pareil. Moi, j'aime bien le dépenser, mais je sais aussi qu'il faut le garder, donc le placer.